In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than death. Among the countless horrors that plague the Imperium of man, few are as absolute, as final, as completely damning as demonic possession. When the entities of the warp breach the barrier between dimensions and invade a mortal body, the result is invariable. The host becomes a vessel for corruption, a gateway through which the ruinous powers pour their malevolence into reality. The infected individual is lost, their soul devoured, their body twisted into an abomination that must be destroyed before it can spread its taint. This is the law. This is the truth. This is what every servant of the Emperor knows with absolute certainty, except when it isn't. In the annals of the Adepta Sororitas, among the countless records of martyrs and saints, of victories won through faith and fury, there exists a category of entries so rare, so unprecedented, that many within the sisterhood question whether they should exist at all. These are the accounts of the exorcised, those who were possessed by the denizens of the warp and yet somehow survived the ordeal. Not merely survived the possession itself, which is horror enough, but survived the brutal exorcism that followed, emerging on the other side, still human, still sane enough to function, still possessed of enough faith that they were not immediately executed as tainted beyond redemption. The existence of such individuals challenges everything the Imperium teaches about the nature of chaos. They are living proof that the absolute can be defied, that damnation is not always inevitable, that a soul touched by the warp might yet return to the Emperor's light. But they are also walking reminders of humanity's greatest weakness, breathing testaments to how close anyone can come to falling into darkness. They inspire both hope and horror in equal measure, and the sisterhood does not know quite what to do with them. This is the story of one such woman, a sister of battle who faced the ultimate test of faith and somehow passed it, only to discover that survival can be its own form of damnation. Her journey from devoted warrior to possessed vessel to penitent outcast reveals truths about the Adepta Sororitas that few outside the Order's militant ever glimpse. It is a tale of unimaginable suffering, of faith tested beyond all reasonable limits, of a life forever marked by scars both visible and invisible. It is the story of what comes after, when you are the one who should have died but didn't, when you carry within you the knowledge of horrors that should have consumed you entirely. Her name, by tradition and necessity, has been struck from the official records. Those who knew her before speak of her only in hushed whispers, if they speak of her at all. To her sisters, Repentia, the penitent warriors with whom she now serves, she is known only as the Twiceborn, a name that carries layers of meaning they do not fully understand. But to herself, in the quiet moments when memory crashes over her like a tide of acid and regret, she remembers who she was before the demon came. She remembers the woman who died so that something else might live in her skin. She remembers, and she can never forget. This is her story. This is the brutal reality of surviving the unsurvivable in the 51st millennium. The Adepta Sororitas, warriors of faith. To understand the weight of what happened to this sister, to comprehend the magnitude of her fall and the impossibility of her survival, we must first understand what the Adepta Sororitas represents within the Imperium of man. They are not merely soldiers. They are not simply the military arm of the ecclesiarchy, though that is their official function. The Sisters of Battle are living embodiments of humanity's faith in the God Emperor, warriors who channel religious devotion into a weapon as potent as any bolter or flamer. The origins of the sisterhood lie in one of the darkest periods of imperial history, the Age of Apostasy, when the High Lord Goga Vandara nearly tore the Imperium apart through tyranny and corruption. It was a young woman named Alicia Dominica who led the resistance against him, guided by faith so pure that she was granted an audience before the Golden Throne itself. What the Emperor showed her and her 5 companions in that moment remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, but it transformed them utterly. When they emerged from the Sanctum Imperialis, they carried with them a mandate from the master of mankind himself, and they would not rest until Vandir was brought to justice. In the aftermath of the apostasy, the decree passive was enacted, forbidding the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. The letter of that law was carefully observed. The newly formed Adepta Sororitas was composed entirely of women, and technically operated independently of the Ministorum, even as they served as its chamber militant. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but endured because the sisterhood proved too valuable to disband and too dangerous to openly oppose. The recruitment of the Adepta Sororitas begins in the Schola Progenium, those grim academies scattered across the Imperium, where the orphans of imperial servants are raised from childhood. These are not ordinary orphans. They are the children of heroes, of men and women who gave their lives in service to the Emperor, and that sacrifice has purchased for their offspring an education that will forge them into the Imperium's elite. From the moment they can walk, these progena are indoctrinated in the imperial creed, trained in combat and tactics, taught that there is no higher calling than to serve the God Emperor, and no greater sin than to fail in that service. For young girls identified as having exceptional faith and martial prowess, representatives of the Adepta Sororitas attend their testing day. These sisters examine the candidates with eyes that have seen the worst horrors the galaxy can offer, searching for that spark of zealous devotion that marks a true daughter of the Emperor. They are not looking for the strongest or the fastest. They are not seeking the most intelligent or the most skilled with weapons, though these qualities certainly matter. What they seek, above all else, is faith. Pure, unwavering, absolute faith in the God Emperor and the righteousness of his Imperium. Those selected are transported to one of the great convents, either on Holy Terra itself or on Ophelia 7, the ecclesiarchy's second most sacred world. There, they undergo years of additional training that would break most human beings. Physical conditioning pushes their bodies to the absolute limits of human endurance. Combat training in every weapon system used by the Sisterhood continues until a novitiate can field strip and reassemble a bolter blindfolded, until she can recite the Litany of Fire while immolating heretics with a flamer, until the handling of sacred war gear becomes as natural as breathing. But the physical training, brutal as it is, represents only half of their preparation. Perhaps less than half. The spiritual conditioning that accompanies it is even more demanding. Novitiates spend hours each day in prayer and meditation, studying the lives of saints and martyrs, memorizing vast passages of Holy Scripture. They learn to channel their faith into something tangible, something that can shield them from lass fire and give strength to their arms when exhaustion should have claimed them. They are taught that faith is not merely belief, but power, that their devotion to the Emperor can literally reshape reality if it burns bright enough. The training is deliberately designed to strip away every trace of individual identity and rebuild the novitiate as a weapon of the ecclesiarchy. Their past lives, whatever families they might have had before the Schola Progenium, become irrelevant. Their fears, their doubts, their personal desires are burned away in the crucible of faith until only devotion remains. Those who cannot endure this process wash out, return to lesser duties within the Ministorum, or reassigned to other imperial institutions. Those who persevere emerge as battle sisters, ready to take their vows and join one of the Order's militant. Once they have completed their training and taken their oaths, battle sisters live according to a rigid code that governs every aspect of their existence. When not actively prosecuting the ecclesiarchy's wars, they divide their time between continued combat training and devotional activities. Morning prayers begin before dawn, followed by weapons practice that can last for hours. Afternoons might be spent in tactical studies or maintenance of equipment, but always with hymns on their lips and prayers in their hearts. Evening prayers mark the transition to night, and even sleep is considered a form of devotion. a necessary preparation of the body for the Emperor's work. This lifestyle produces warriors who are utterly unlike any other fighting force in the Imperium. Battle Sisters match Space Marines in dedication while remaining fundamentally human in a way the gene-enhanced Astartes are not. They lack the biological advantages of the Emperor's Angels of Death, the enhanced organs and modified physiology that make Space Marines superhuman. Instead, they rely on superior training, exceptional equipment, and most importantly, faith that can literally manifest as miraculous interventions. The acts of faith, for which the Adepta Sororitas are famous, represent the most visible proof of the Emperor's favor. When a battle sister's devotion reaches its peak, when her prayers rise with such fervor that they pierce the veil between the material and the divine, reality itself bends to accommodate her faith. Wounds that should be fatal close before her eyes. Bolter shells that should miss their mark strike with impossible accuracy. Flamers burn with heat intense enough to reduce even power armor to slag. These are not psychic powers, not the dangerous manipulation of the warp that taints any who use it. These are miracles, pure manifestations of the God Emperor's will channeled through vessels worthy of his attention. Every battle sister knows that such divine intervention cannot be commanded or predicted. The Emperor grants his blessings as he sees fit, not at the whim of mortal supplicants. But they also know that he rewards those who demonstrate absolute faith in the face of impossible odds. Those who stand firm when lesser souls would flee. Those who choose martyrdom over survival, if that is what his will demands. This knowledge shapes everything the sisterhood does. It makes them fearless in battle, confident that death in the Emperor's service is the greatest honor they could achieve. It makes them merciless toward the Emperor's enemies, knowing that any who oppose his will are not merely military foes, but metaphysical threats to the very fabric of reality. To serve as a battle sister is to exist in a state of constant spiritual warfare, even when no physical battles are being fought. Every moment of every day is a test of faith, an opportunity to prove devotion or reveal weakness. There is no room for doubt, no space for questions about the righteousness of their cause. The Imperium's enemies are not merely wrong, but actively evil, servants of dark powers that seek humanity's complete annihilation. Every heretic burned, every mutant purged, every Xenos slain is a victory not just for the Imperium, but for the very concept of order and sanity in a galaxy that would otherwise collapse into chaos. This worldview creates warriors of exceptional effectiveness, but also of exceptional rigidity. The Adepta Sororitas do not compromise. They do not negotiate with the Emperor's enemies. They do not show mercy to those who have rejected the Imperial creed or fallen into corruption. And most relevant to our story, they do not tolerate taint of any kind among their own ranks. A battle sister who shows signs of corruption, who demonstrates weakness of faith, who fails to maintain the absolute purity demanded of the sisterhood, cannot be allowed to remain among her sisters. The standards are merciless because anything less would risk the spiritual integrity of the entire order. Understanding demonic possession. In the vast catalogue of horrors that fill the Warhammer 40,000 universe, demonic possession stands apart. It is not merely death, not simply the end of existence. It is the complete subversion of a human soul, the transformation of a loyal servant of the Emperor into a gateway for the most malevolent entities in existence. To be possessed is to become a weapon wielded by the ruinous powers themselves, a cancer within the body of humanity that will spread unless it is immediately and ruthlessly excised. The demons that inhabit the warp are not creatures in any conventional sense. They are not born, do not age, do not truly die. They are living concepts, condensations of emotional energy given form and malevolent intelligence by the psychic emanations of sentient beings. Rage and bloodlust fuel the Demonkin of Khorne. Schemes and ambition empower the servants of Tzeentch. Despair and entropy feed the entities that serve Nurgle, while excess and sensation sustain those devoted to Slaanesh. These creatures exist in a realm where the normal rules of physics do not apply, where thought and reality are one and the same, where desire and manifestation occur simultaneously. The barrier between the material universe and the Imperium, between reality as humans understand it and the screaming chaos of the warp, is maintained by a fundamental incompatibility between the two realms. Demons cannot simply walk into reality whenever they choose. They require gateways, weak points, where the membrane between dimensions has grown thin enough for them to push through. Psychic activity creates such vulnerabilities. Intense emotions, especially negative ones, can weaken the veil. Certain astronomical phenomena, strange configurations of warp space, or artifacts of terrible power can serve as anchors that allow demonic entities to manifest. But by far the most effective and reliable method for a demon to enter real space is through possession of a living host. Psykers, individuals capable of manipulating the energies of the warp through their own mental discipline, represent the most common targets for possession. Their very nature makes them beacons in the immaterial realm, shining lights that draw demonic attention from across vast distances. The untrained psyker, particularly one who does not even know they possess such abilities, is hideously vulnerable to demonic invasion. A single moment of weakness, a flash of strong emotion channeled unconsciously through psychic power, and a door opens that cannot easily be closed. But psykers are not the only vulnerable souls in the Imperium. Anyone exposed to the corrupting influence of chaos can become a target. Cultists who willingly open themselves to demonic forces obviously invite possession, trading their humanity for power they believe they can control. They are always wrong. Soldiers fighting on demon worlds or near warp rifts may find their defenses eroded by constant exposure to corruption. Scholars who study forbidden texts might inadvertently create an opening through knowledge that should never have been learned. Even the faithful can become vulnerable if their faith wavers at the wrong moment, if doubt or despair creates a crack in their spiritual armor. The process of possession varies in duration and intensity. Sometimes it happens in an instant, a demon forcing its way through a suddenly opened gateway and overwhelming the host's consciousness before resistance is possible. More often, it is a gradual process that unfolds over days or weeks. The demon worms its way into the victim's unconscious mind, whispering thoughts that seem to be the host's own, gently nudging decisions in directions that serve the entity's purposes. Paranoia grows, behavior becomes erratic, strange compulsions manifest. By the time the host realizes something is wrong, if they ever do, it is far too late. The demon has established itself too deeply to be easily dislodged. The physical symptoms of possession appear gradually in most cases. The eyes might change color, taking on an unnatural hue, or developing pupils that are not quite human. Skin might develop lesions or markings that form patterns too precise to be random. The voice changes, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, acquiring harmonics or tones that no human throat should produce. Unnatural strength manifests, allowing the possessed to perform feats of strength or endurance impossible for their apparent physical condition. In advanced cases, actual mutations begin to appear as the demon reshapes its host's flesh to better suit its nature. The psychological changes are even more dramatic. Personality shifts become pronounced as the demon asserts more control. Memories become confused or disappear entirely. The host might experience periods of lost time, waking with no recollection of what they did or where they went. Voices echo in their mind, sometimes whispers, sometimes screams, always pushing them toward actions they would normally consider abhorrent. The individual they were before the possession begins to erode, hollowed out from within until only a shell remains, puppeted by a force that delights in their suffering. For those who witness possession from the outside, the signs become unmistakable as the condition progresses. Sudden outbursts of violence, speaking in tongues, or reciting knowledge the person could not possibly possess. Physical strength that should be impossible. An aura of wrongness that makes people instinctively recoil. Most damning of all, psychic. Individuals in proximity to the possessed often report sensing the presence of the warp itself, the screaming chaos of the Imperium bleeding through into reality wherever the host goes. The Imperium's response to confirmed or even suspected possession is always the same: immediate execution. There is no treatment, no cure, no possibility of saving the host once a demon has taken residence. The infected individual is considered already dead, their body merely a shell animated by something that wears their face like a mask. Mercy, in such cases, takes the form of a bolt round to the head or immolation by flamer. Quick death is the kindest fate possible, both for the host and for anyone who might otherwise be exposed to the demon's influence. This is doctrine. This is law. This is the only sane response to an existential threat that could spread like plague, if not immediately contained. The possessed are lost. They cannot be recovered. To think otherwise is to invite the very corruption one seeks to fight. And yet, in rare cases, exorcism is attempted. The protagonist's background. She was born on a world whose name she no longer remembers, daughter of parents whose faces have faded from memory like morning mist under a harsh sun. What she knows of her early childhood comes not from personal recollection, but from the sterile documents filed in the Schola Progenium archives. Father: infantry lieutenant, Astra Militarum, killed in action against Orc incursion, posthumously awarded the Eagle of Valor. Mother: senior administrator, Planetary Logistics Division, died in industrial accident 3 months later. Surviving child: female, age 7, physically healthy, psychologically traumatized, recommended for immediate transport to nearest Schola facility. The day they came for her is one of the few clear memories from before the Schola. She had been living with her mother's sister, a woman who did her duty but had 6 children of her own and no real capacity to absorb another. The administratum officers arrived in the early morning, their black uniforms crisp and proper, their faces carefully neutral. They explained to her aunt that the girl was being claimed by the Imperium, that this was an honor beyond measure, that she would be educated and trained to serve the God Emperor in ways that would make her parents' sacrifices meaningful. Her aunt had nodded, signed the required documents, and sent the girl to pack her meager possessions without once meeting her eyes. The journey to the Schola took 3 weeks aboard a transport ship whose holds were filled with similar orphans from across the sector. Some of the children cried constantly. Others stared into space with empty eyes, already broken by losses too great for their young minds to process. A few, like her, remained watchfully quiet, assessing this new reality with the calculating attention of someone who had already learned that survival required understanding the rules of whatever environment you found yourself in. The Schola Progenium on Meridian Prime was not the largest such facility in the Imperium, nor the most prestigious, but it was thorough in its methods. From the day she arrived, every aspect of her existence was structured to transform her from a frightened child into a potential servant of the Emperor. The drill abbots who oversaw the progenitor were not cruel for cruelty's sake, but they were utterly without sentiment. Weakness was identified and either corrected or punished. Failure meant repetition of exercises until success was achieved, or the student collapsed from exhaustion. Excellence earned nothing more than a curt nod and the opportunity to face new and greater challenges. She learned quickly. Some children resisted the indoctrination, clinging to memories of softer times or concepts of mercy and kindness that had no place in the Imperium's harsh reality. These children rarely lasted long. Either they adapted or they were reassigned to roles that required less mental fortitude. She observed this process with the same calculating attention she applied to everything, and she made the choice that countless progenitor before her had made. She would become what they wanted her to become, perfectly and completely, because anything less was failure, and failure was unacceptable. The physical training was brutal. Hour after hour of calisthenics, running, climbing, combat drills. Her hands learned the weight and balance of weapons before she fully understood what those weapons were for. Her body was pushed past what she thought possible, then pushed further still. When she wanted to quit, when exhaustion made her limbs feel like lead and her lungs burn with each breath, she thought of her father dying on some distant battlefield, thought of the strangers who had raised her until the Imperium claimed her, thought of the fact that millions of orphans across the galaxy would give anything to be in her place. And she kept going. The spiritual training proved equally demanding, though in different ways. Every morning began with prayers, the words repeated so often they became automatic. The catechisms of hate against the Xenos, the litanies of purity against corruption, the devotionals of duty to the God Emperor and his Imperium. At first, they were just words, sounds without real meaning beyond the knowledge that she needed to memorize them or face punishment. But gradually, through years of repetition and the constant reinforcement of everything the scholar taught, they became something more. They became truth. They became the framework through which she understood the universe. By her 10th year, she had internalized the core lessons of the Imperial Creed so completely that she could not imagine thinking any other way. The Emperor was humanity's savior and protector, the only force standing between mankind and total annihilation. Service to him was the highest calling any human could achieve. Death in that service was glorious, to be welcomed rather than feared. The enemies of the Imperium, whether Xenos or heretic or demon, were not merely opponents to be defeated, but existential threats that had to be destroyed with absolute ruthlessness. Any weakness, any hesitation, any mercy shown to such enemies was a betrayal of everything the Emperor stood for. She believed all of this with the fervor of someone who had never been taught to question. To question was heresy, to doubt was corruption, faith was truth, and truth was absolute. In her 14th year, during the annual testing day when representatives from various imperial organizations arrived to select Progena for specialized training, she caught the attention of a sister of battle from the Order of the Ebon Chalice. The sister, whose face was hidden behind the skull-faced helmet of a canoness, studied her for long minutes while the girl stood at attention, heart pounding, knowing that this moment would determine the course of her entire life. "Your faith is strong," the canoness said finally, her voice amplified by Vox speakers to fill the examination hall. "But faith alone is not enough. Show me your determination. Show me your willingness to sacrifice everything for the Emperor's glory." What followed was a test that would have broken most candidates. 3 days of combat exercises without sleep or food, beyond minimal rations. Theological examinations that required perfect recitation of scripture while enduring physical stress designed to break concentration. Loyalty tests that placed her in situations where following orders required overcoming every instinct towards self-preservation. Through it all, she endured. Not because she was stronger or smarter than the others, but because she wanted it more, because failure was simply not something she could accept. On the evening of the 3rd day, when she was swaying on her feet from exhaustion, when her voice had grown hoarse from reciting prayers, when her body screamed for rest and her mind felt like it might shatter from the strain, the canoness removed her helmet and looked at her with eyes that had seen centuries of war. "You will do," she said simply. "Pack your belongings. You depart for Ophelia 7 at dawn." The next 5 years were spent in the Order's training convent, where she was transformed from a progena into a novitiate, and finally, into a full battle sister. The regimen made the Schola Progenium look gentle by comparison. Combat training now included live fire exercises where actual casualties occasionally occurred. The spiritual conditioning went beyond mere indoctrination to something approaching mysticism, teaching her to channel her faith into tangible force. She learned the maintenance and operation of power armor, how to move in the ceramite shell that would become her second skin. She was trained in every weapon system the sisterhood employed, from the humble bolt gun to the devastating melter gun to the holy promethium of the flamer. Most importantly, she learned what it meant to be a sister of battle. Not just the techniques and tactics, but the philosophy that underpinned everything the Adepta Sororitas represented. They were not merely soldiers, they were living prayers, embodiments of humanity's faith in the Emperor, given form and purpose. Every battle they fought was an act of worship. Every enemy they slew was an offering on the altar of imperial righteousness. To die in combat was not tragedy, but triumph. Proof that the Emperor found them worthy of martyrdom in his service. She took her vows on her 19th birthday, kneeling before the altar in the convent's great chapel, while the canoness placed her hand on the Book of Martyrs and spoke the words that would bind her to the order for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. For 12 years, she served the Order of the Ebon Chalice with distinction. She fought on 17 different worlds against enemies ranging from orc warbands to heretical cults to chaos renegades. She earned commendations for valor in combat and for her unwavering faith under fire. She rose to the rank of Sister Superior, leading her own squad of battle sisters into battle. She witnessed miracles, saw her prayers answered in the form of divine intervention when her squad should have been overrun. She burned heretics by the hundreds, watched their screaming forms collapse into ash while she sang hymns of praise to the Emperor. She was everything a battle sister should be: faithful, dedicated, merciless toward the Emperor's enemies, willing to lay down her life without hesitation if the mission demanded it. She had found her purpose, her place in the grand machinery of the Imperium. She had become a weapon in the Emperor's hand, and she asked for nothing more than the opportunity to serve. And then came the world of Tertius Prime, and everything she was came to an end. The possession event. Tertius Prime had been an agri-world, one of countless planets dedicated to producing food for the teeming masses of the Imperium. Vast fields of engineered crops stretched from horizon to horizon, tended by generations of farmers who knew nothing beyond their labor and their prayers to the God Emperor. It was not a wealthy world or a particularly important one, but it served its function in the great machine of imperial logistics, and that was enough, until the cults came. The Inquisition's investigation after the fact would reveal that the corruption had been growing for decades, hidden beneath the veneer of loyal service. A few discontented souls, unhappy with the grinding poverty and backbreaking labor that was their lot, had listened to whispers in the dark. They had been promised a better life, freedom from servitude, power to reshape their world according to their will. What they received instead was damnation. But by the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late. The infection had spread, converting entire communities, turning the planet's leadership toward the ruinous powers. By the time the Imperium discovered what was happening, Tertius Prime was lost. The choice was simple: authorize exterminatus and purge the world with orbital bombardment, or commit ground forces to reclaim it. The Administratum's calculations indicated that the planet's agricultural output was significant enough to warrant the expenditure of resources for reclamation rather than destruction. Orders were issued. Imperial Guard regiments were diverted from other campaigns, and the Order of the Ebon Chalice was tasked with spearheading the assault on the primary hive city where the cult's leadership had established their stronghold. She remembered the descent through Tertius Prime's atmosphere, her squad's rhino transport shuddering as it cut through the thick clouds that perpetually shrouded the world. Through the armored viewing port, she could see dozens of other transports in formation around them, an entire company of battle sisters, supported by elements from the Imperial Guard. It was a substantial force, but intelligence indicated the cultists had armed themselves well and would not surrender easily. The landing zone was a hab complex on the outskirts of the hive, selected for its strategic value and relative security. As the transports descended, she led her squad in the litany of descent, their voices raised in prayer even as they checked weapons and prepared for deployment. Emperor, preserve us in our hour of need. Guide our aim against the faithless. Grant us the strength to bring your judgment to those who have rejected your light. The landing was unopposed, which should have been the first warning. Cultists should have contested every inch of ground, but the complex appeared deserted. Her squad deployed in combat formation, bolters raised, scanning for threats through the rain that had begun to fall, turning the streets into rivers of mud and industrial runoff. Sister Superior, one of her battle sisters reported, her voice crackling over the vox. Reading movement in the central structure, multiple contacts, they're not trying to hide. Formation advance, she ordered, feeling the familiar calm that came over her in combat. Flamers to the front. If they're herded in there, we'll burn them out. They advanced through streets lined with abandoned buildings, past propaganda posters that had once proclaimed loyalty to the Emperor, but now bore defacements and symbols that hurt to look at. The rain continued to fall, washing away some of the filth but unable to cleanse the spiritual corruption that permeated this place. She could feel it, a wrongness in the air that made her armor's machine spirit whisper warnings in languages she did not understand. The central structure had been a shrine to the Emperor, a modest chapel where workers would come to pray before their shifts. Now it had been desecrated, its statues toppled, its walls covered in blasphemous text written in what might have been blood. The doors hung open, inviting them inside. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. Stay alert, she told her squad, then activated her vox to report to the canoness commanding the operation. Sister Superior Katerin reporting. We've reached the primary target. It appears to be a trap. Understood, the canoness's voice replied. Set charges and withdraw. We'll bring down the structure with them inside. It was the sensible decision, the safe decision. But before she could give the order, screaming erupted from deeper in the structure. Not the shouts of cultists preparing to attack, but genuine terror, the sound of people dying badly. Sister Superior, do you hear that? One of her squad asked, her flamer tracking across the doorway. There are civilians inside. She froze. Intelligence had indicated the area was evacuated, that anyone remaining was a cultist or collaborator. But those screams did not sound like the voices of heretics facing judgment. They sounded like the cries of innocents being murdered. Canoness, I'm hearing civilian casualties inside the structure, she reported, requesting permission to investigate. The pause before the response lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Denied, plant charges and withdraw. This is obviously an attempt to lure you inside. She stood in the rain, bolter raised, listening to the screams that continued to echo from within the desecrated shrine. Every part of her training told her to obey. Orders were absolute. The canoness understood the tactical situation better than she did. To disobey was to place her squad at risk for the sake of cultists who had probably helped bring this catastrophe upon their world. But those screams, they sounded so much like the cries she had heard from her mother on the day she died, pinned beneath machinery in an industrial accident, begging for help that came too late. Sister Superior, one of her squad prompted. Your orders? She made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. We're going in. 2 battle sisters with me. The rest, establish a perimeter. If we're not out in 5 minutes, bring down the structure. They entered the shrine with weapons raised, moving through the desecrated nave toward the screaming. The interior was worse than the exterior, every surface defiled with symbols that made her eyes water to look upon them. Candles burned with flames that were the wrong color. The air felt thick, resistant, as if they were wading through water. The screaming was coming from below, from the catacombs where the faithful would traditionally be interred. They descended stairs slick with something that was not quite water, their armor's lamps cutting through darkness that seemed to devour light. At the bottom, they found a chamber that had been transformed into a ritual space, its walls covered in the same blasphemous text from above, its floor marked with patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center, surrounded by the corpses of what must have been a dozen cultists, stood a single figure. She was just a girl, perhaps 14 years old, dressed in the rough clothing of a hab worker. Blood covered her hands and face, though none of it appeared to be her own. Her eyes, when she turned to look at the battle sisters, were completely black, as if the pupils had expanded to consume the entire orb. "You came," the girl said, but the voice was wrong. Harmonics layered over harmonics, speaking with tones no human throat should produce. "We knew you would. Faith is such a predictable weakness." She pulled the trigger without hesitation, her bolt pistol roaring in the confined space. The shell should have taken the girl in the chest, should have exploded inside her body and reduced her torso to fragments. Instead, it stopped inches from her skin, hanging in the air for a moment before dropping harmlessly to the floor. "Sister Superior, I'm not reading her as human," one of the battle sisters reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. "The Auspex is showing warp presence. It's a demon host." "Retreat," she ordered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The patterns on the floor began to glow, lines of sickly light spreading from the girl toward them, and suddenly the air itself had become thick as mud, resistant, holding them in place. The girl, or the thing wearing the girl's body, began to laugh. It was a sound that made reality feel thin, as if the universe itself might tear open from the strain of containing it. "You wanted to save her, the precious innocent, but there was never anything to save. She opened the door herself. She invited us in. And now..." The thing moved, faster than anything had a right to move, crossing the distance between them in an instant. She saw it reach out, saw its hand connect with her armor's breastplate, and felt something terrible pour into her through that touch. It was like drowning in acid, while simultaneously burning from the inside out. It was every nightmare she had ever experienced compressed into a single moment of absolute horror. She felt the thing enter her, felt it forcing its way through defenses she had not known she possessed, battering aside her faith like it was paper before a firestorm. And then it was inside, and she was screaming, and her squad was shouting, and the last thing she remembered clearly was the canoness's voice over the vox demanding a status report, while she fell to her knees and reached for her bolter with hands that were no longer entirely under her control. The exorcism. The period between the moment of possession and the beginning of the exorcism exists in her memory as fragments, shards of experience that do not quite connect into a coherent whole. Later, after everything that followed, she would spend countless hours trying to reconstruct what happened during those lost days, attempting to understand what the daemon had done while wearing her skin. The effort would always fail. The human mind is not equipped to properly recall being a passenger in its own body, watching from behind eyes that no longer obey, screaming in a voice that cannot be heard. What she knows comes from the testimony of others, assembled painstakingly through conversations she should never have been allowed to have. The demon had killed 2 members of her squad before they managed to retreat from the shrine. According to the after-action reports, it had torn one battle sister's helmet from her power armor with its bare hands, an impossible feat of strength, and crushed her skull before anyone could react. The second it had shot with her own bolt pistol, emptying the entire magazine into the woman's armor until the ceramite finally gave way and allowed the mass-reactive rounds to detonate inside her body. Her squad, to their credit, had not hesitated. They had opened fire on her even as she murdered their sisters, pouring bolter fire and flamer washes into the shrine until the entire structure was collapsing around them. They had been willing to kill her to stop the demon, exactly as their training demanded, exactly as she would have wanted if she had been capable of expressing preference. But demons are not easy to destroy, especially when they inhabit the body of someone protected by power armor. The thing wearing her skin had escaped the shrine's collapse, fighting its way through her own squad with a ferocity that left another 3 battle sisters dead before it broke through their perimeter and disappeared into the rain-soaked streets of the Hab complex. What followed was a hunt that consumed the next 18 hours. The canoness, recognizing both the threat and the opportunity, had declared a lockdown on the entire operations area. No one was to leave. Every battle sister in the company was mobilized to track down the possessed member of their order. Imperial Guard units were pulled from their assigned positions to establish cordon lines. The entire complex became a cage designed to prevent one thing from escaping: her body, animated by something that should never have been allowed to exist in reality. They found her, eventually, in a chapel 3 kilometers from the original shrine. She, or rather the demon, had slaughtered everyone inside, both cultists and civilians who had sought sanctuary there. The bodies were arranged in patterns, their blood used to paint symbols on every surface. At the center of the carnage, she knelt in prayer, or something that resembled prayer, speaking in tongues while her armor smoked and sparked from the damage it had sustained during the hunt. The capture itself required 3 Battle Sister squads working in coordination, supported by sanctioned psychers who helped contain the demon's influence. Even then, it had been a near thing. The demon had fought with desperation born of knowing what awaited it, using her body past all reasonable limits, breaking bones and tearing muscles in its efforts to escape. In the end, they had used blessed chains to bind her, wrapping her in restraints that had been sanctified by the ecclesiarchy specifically for containing the possessed. Then came the argument that would determine whether she lived or died. Standard protocol was unambiguous. Possessed individuals were to be executed immediately. The host was considered already dead, their body merely a shell worn by something that delighted in humanity's suffering. Mercy meant a bolt round to the head, ensuring the demon was banished back to the warp and could spread no further corruption. The canoness stood over her bound form, bolt pistol drawn, preparing to carry out this duty. By all logic, by every rule and regulation that governed the Adepta Sororitas, the woman lying chained before them was already dead. The thing that had murdered 5 battle sisters deserved nothing but destruction. But something made the canoness hesitate. Perhaps it was the fact that the possession had occurred during a mission where orders had been disobeyed, raising questions about culpability. Perhaps it was the unprecedented nature of seeing a battle sister, someone whose faith should have made her resistant to such corruption, become a vessel for demonic entities. Or perhaps it was simple pragmatism, recognizing that this presented an opportunity to learn something about how possession occurred and how it might be prevented. Whatever the reason, the canoness did not pull the trigger. Instead, she activated her vox and contacted the Inquisition. 3 days later, an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus arrived aboard a ship whose presence in system had not been announced and whose name was not recorded in any official logs. He came accompanied by a retinue that included 2 demon hosts of his own, bound entities kept under control through methods that the battle sisters were not permitted to understand, and a cadre of specialists whose specific roles were never fully explained. The Inquisitor examined her for hours while she remained bound, the demon inside her alternately raging and pleading, speaking in voices that ranged from her own to something that sounded like grinding metal to the screaming of souls in torment. Finally, he rendered his judgment. "The host still lives," he declared. "I can sense her consciousness, buried deep but not yet consumed. The possession is recent enough that exorcism may be attempted. The probability of success is low, but I am authorized to make the attempt if you are willing to transfer custody to the Inquisition." The canoness considered this for a long time, staring at the woman who had been one of her most reliable battle sisters, now reduced to a thrashing, cursing thing that bore only superficial resemblance to human. "If she survives," the canoness said finally, "what becomes of her?" "That depends on many factors," the Inquisitor replied. "But she would never serve as a battle sister again. The taint of possession is not something that can be ignored, even if the demon is successfully expelled. At best, she might find service in some capacity where her experience could prove valuable." "Proceed with the exorcism," the canoness ordered. Then she turned to the assembled battle sisters who had witnessed this conversation. What happens here does not leave this room. As far as the Order is concerned, Sister Superior Catherine died a martyr's death fighting against demon incursion. Her name will be entered into the Book of Martyrs, and her armor interred in the Chapel of Heroes. We will speak no more of this. They transported her to the Inquisitor's ship in restraints so heavy it took 6 men to carry them. The ship itself was a black vessel, unknown class, that somehow managed to escape detection by every auspex and auger in the system. Its interior was wrong. The corridors bent in ways that suggested the architects had possessed only tangential understanding of 3-dimensional geometry. The air tasted of ozone and ashes. Sounds echoed in patterns that should not have been physically possible. They brought her to a chamber deep in the ship's heart, a space that had been sanctified by so many layers of ritual that reality itself seemed reluctant to fully manifest there. The walls were covered in text, prayers in languages she did not recognize, mixed with mathematical formulas and diagrams that hurt to look at directly. At the center stood an altar of black stone, its surface marked with channels designed to carry blood. The Inquisitor began his preparations while she hung suspended in chains, the demon inside her screaming threats and promises in equal measure. For 3 days, he and his specialists worked, inscribing circles of protection, lighting candles made from rendered human fat mixed with sanctified wax, preparing instruments whose purposes she could not guess, but which filled her, or the part of her that could still feel, with terror so profound it transcended rational thought. The exorcism itself began with prayer. Not the prayers she had learned in the Schola Progenium or the convent, but something older, words that felt like they had been spoken since before the Imperium existed. The Inquisitor's voice rolled through the chamber, commanding, demanding, calling upon the God Emperor's power to cast out the intruder from his servant's flesh. The demon, predictably, did not go quietly. It fought with everything it possessed, using her body as a weapon against itself. Bones cracked as muscles tensed beyond their breaking point. Her voice, distorted by the demon's influence, shrieked curses in languages that predated human speech. Blood vessels burst, painting the inside of her armor with crimson. The pain was indescribable. Not merely physical torment, though that was part of it, but spiritual agony, the sensation of something being torn from the deepest parts of her being. The Inquisitor pressed forward, his prayers growing more forceful, more commanding. He spoke the demon's true name, sounds that made the air itself ripple and compelled it to manifest. The thing emerged partially from her body, a half-formed nightmare of teeth and too many eyes and geometries that defied comprehension, still anchored to her, but forced into partial visibility by the power of the exorcism. And then, the most dangerous part of the ritual began. The demon had to be named, bound, and banished, all while ensuring it took no part of her soul with it when it departed. If the exorcism failed at this stage, if the Inquisitor's concentration wavered even slightly, the demon would either fully possess her or tear her soul to pieces as it was ripped away. She, or the part of her that remained capable of thought amid the screaming chaos of the possession, tried to pray. The words of the Litany of Faith came to her, not from memory, but from something deeper, some core of devotion that the demon had been unable to fully corrupt. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, or tried to whisper, her voice lost in the cacophony of the exorcism. "His light guides me through darkness. His strength sustains me when mine fails." The Inquisitor seized on this, using her own faith as a weapon against the demon. "Hear your host," he commanded, his voice cutting through every other sound in the chamber. "Hear her devotion to the Master of Mankind. You have no power here, creature of the warp. This soul belongs to the Emperor, and you cannot claim what is his." For hours, the battle raged. The demon would seem to weaken, only to surge back with renewed fury. she felt herself being pulled in multiple directions, stretched between the demon's need to maintain its hold and the exorcism's effort to tear it free. Several times, she felt certain that she was going to die, that the process would simply destroy her, that her soul would be torn apart in the struggle between these two overwhelming forces. And then, in a moment that she could never properly explain even to herself, something shifted. The demon's grip loosened, just slightly, just enough. The Inquisitor's prayers reached a crescendo, power flowing through words that seemed to reshape reality itself. There was a sensation of tearing, of something being ripped away, and suddenly she could breathe again, think again, exist in her own body without something else screaming in the depths of her consciousness. The demon's scream as it was banished back to the warp was a sound that would echo in her nightmares for the rest of her life. It was fury and frustration and promise of vengeance, a proclamation that this was not over, that it would remember her, that it would find her again in whatever passed for dreams in the afterlife. And then it was gone, and she collapsed in her chains, barely conscious, barely alive, but somehow, impossibly, still herself. The Inquisitor stood over her, breathing heavily, his face pale with exhaustion. "She lives," he said to his assembled specialists. "Record this as successful exorcism. The host has survived." One of the specialists, a woman whose eyes were covered by a blindfold marked with wards, tilted her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. "She is damaged. The demon left marks. She will never be fully free of its touch." "Few exorcised are," the Inquisitor replied. He looked down at her with something that might have been pity, though his voice remained clinical when he spoke. "Can you hear me? Do you understand where you are?" She tried to answer, but her voice had been destroyed by the demon's screaming. All that emerged was a rasping croak, barely audible even in the sudden silence of the chamber. "You survived," the Inquisitor continued, "which means, despite everything that happened, some part of you maintained its faith through the possession. That is unprecedented. I have performed 17 exorcisms in my career. You are the 5th to survive the process, and the only one who retained enough of their mind to be considered remotely functional afterward." He paused, studying her with the clinical attention of someone examining an interesting specimen. "What comes next will not be pleasant. The physical damage can be repaired mostly. The psychological trauma, that will stay with you. And the spiritual taint, the fact that you were possessed at all, means you can never return to your old life. The Adepta Sororitas will not accept you back. Even if they would, you would pose too great a risk of repossession." She wanted to scream, to rage against this pronouncement, to insist that her faith was strong enough to overcome any taint. But she could barely remain conscious, and some part of her, deep down, knew he was right. She could feel the changes in herself, the places where the demon had left its mark. She would never be the same woman who had led her squad into that desecrated shrine. "You have 2 choices," the Inquisitor said. "I can grant you the Emperor's peace here and now. A bolt shell to the head, quick and clean. You would be remembered as a martyr, a battle sister who died fighting against demonic corruption. It would be merciful. Or," she managed to croak, "or you continue. You accept what you have become, what the possession has left you with, and you find a new way to serve. It will not be glorious. It will probably be short, given how few exorcise survive long after the ritual, but you would be alive. That is more than most possessed can say." She closed her eyes, feeling tears streak down her face, mixing with the blood and other fluids that covered her skin. Every part of her body hurt. Every memory was tainted with the shadow of what the demon had shown her. She knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. "I choose to live," she whispered. The Inquisitor nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected. "Then we begin your recovery, and after that, we determine what use can be made of a woman who should be dead but isn't." Physical scars and mutations. The medical bay where they took her for recovery was pristine and cold, filled with equipment whose purpose she could only guess at. The medici servitors that attended her worked with mechanical efficiency, their augmetic limbs precisely measuring and recording every aspect of her condition. Pain suppressors kept the worst of the agony at bay, but she could still feel everything being done to her, every scan and probe and sampling of tissues that should not have survived the trauma they had endured. The chief medici, a woman whose half of her face had been replaced with augmetics that allowed her to see in spectrums beyond human perception, stood over her with a data slate and catalogued the damage with clinical precision. Multiple fractures throughout the skeletal structure, she began, her mechan dendrites recording every word while simultaneously taking tissue samples. The demon forced her body past all reasonable limits. Her left femur was completely shattered, the fragments held together only by the armor's internal bracing. 3 vertebrae in the cervical spine show stress fractures. Both clavicles are cracked. The right radius has a compound fracture that should have been immediately fatal if it had breached the skin in combat conditions. She paused, zooming in on scans that showed her internal organs. The muscular damage is extensive. Several major muscle groups show tearing consistent with strain beyond human maximum. The heart itself shows signs of stress that would normally only be seen in cases of catastrophic system failure. How she remained conscious through the exorcism is remarkable. And the mutations? The Inquisitor asked, standing at a distance, but watching everything with an attention that missed nothing. The medici's expression, or what remained of her human expression, became troubled. Numerous. The possession left biological markers that cannot be fully removed without destroying the host. I can list them in order of severity. She proceeded to do exactly that. And with each item, the woman lying on the medical slab felt a new wave of horror wash over her. The eyes were the most obvious change. Where before they had been unremarkable brown, now they carried flecks of crimson that seemed to shift and move depending on the light. In certain illumination, her pupils would appear to have a faint inner glow, like embers in darkness. The medici explained that this was a result of warp energy having directly interacted with her optic nerves, fundamentally altering the way they processed visual information. It was, technically, harmless, but it marked her as someone who had been touched by forces that should never interact with human biology. Her hands were similarly changed. The fingers were longer than they should be, the joints capable of bending at angles that no normal human anatomy would allow. It was subtle enough that casual observation might miss it, but anyone who looked closely would notice that something was wrong, that these hands did not quite match the rest of her body. Worse, the skin on her palms bore markings, faint patterns that resembled scar tissue, but formed symbols she did not recognize. The medici indicated these were a form of brand, placed there by the demon as a way of claiming her flesh as its own. Along her spine, from the base of her skull to her tailbone, ran a line of hardened tissue that felt like bone beneath the skin, but registered on scans as something else entirely. The medici could not fully explain what this structure was or what purpose it served, only that it had not been there before the possession and showed no signs of being removable without catastrophic damage to her nervous system. Most disturbing were the vocalizations. Her voice, already damaged by the demon's screaming, now carried harmonics that should not exist in human speech. When she spoke, if someone listened carefully, they could hear faint echoes of other voices layered beneath her words, whispers in languages that predated human civilization. The medici explained that the demon had altered her larynx and the associated neural pathways, creating a permanent resonance that she would never be able to fully suppress. There were other changes, smaller but no less significant. Her blood, when tested, showed trace amounts of substances that should not exist in reality. Her cellular structure had been fundamentally altered at a genetic level, making her technically human, but not quite baseline human. Her brain waves showed patterns that indicated she now perceived reality in ways that diverged from normal human consciousness, as if the demon's presence had opened doorways in her perception that could never be fully closed. "Can any of this be fixed?" she asked, her distorted voice making the question sound like a plea from something inhuman. The Medici shook her head. "The biological changes are too integrated with your core systems. To remove them would require essentially rebuilding your body from the genetic level up, which is theoretically possible, but practically impossible, given the resources required and the high probability of rejection. You would have perhaps a 5% chance of surviving such a procedure, and the result would not be you in any meaningful sense." "Then what do I do?" The question came out as a whisper, but the harmonics in her voice made it sound like multiple people were asking simultaneously. "You adapt," the Inquisitor said, from his position across the room. "You learn to live with what you have become. The exercised rarely look fully human afterward. The warp leaves marks that cannot be erased. You are fortunate, relatively speaking. I have seen survivors whose physical mutations were far more severe." "Fortunate," she repeated, the word tasting like ashes in her mouth. Over the following weeks, as her bones knit back together and the worst of the internal damage repaired itself through a combination of medics' intervention and the remarkable resilience of power-armored bodies, she was forced to confront her new reality. The woman who looked back at her from reflective surfaces was not the person she remembered being. The face was similar, but wrong in ways that went beyond the altered eyes and the shadows that seemed to cling to her skin. She looked like someone who had died and been imperfectly resurrected, a corpse animated by will and technology, but lacking some essential spark of life. The Medici taught her how to minimize the most visible mutations. Colored lenses could hide the crimson flecks in her eyes, though nothing could disguise the faint glow in darkness. Gloves became mandatory to conceal the extended fingers and palm markings. She learned to speak in carefully modulated tones that suppressed the worst of the harmonic distortions, though it required constant conscious effort and failed whenever emotion overrode her control. But no amount of camouflage could hide what she had become from those who knew what to look for. Anyone with experience of the warp, anyone who had studied demonic possession or worked with the Ordo Malleus, would recognize the signs immediately. She was marked, tainted, forever changed by her contact with forces that no human should survive touching. The psychological impact of these changes went beyond simple disgust at her altered appearance. Every time she looked at her hands, she was reminded of the demon's touch. Every time she heard the echoes in her voice, she remembered the things speaking through her, using her throat to form words that had never been meant for human tongues. The markings on her palms burned sometimes, phantom pain with no physical cause, as if the demon had left nerve endings specifically designed to torment her. Sleep, when she could achieve it, brought no respite. The dreams were always the same, the demon's voice promising to return, to reclaim what it considered its property, to finish what it had started. She would wake screaming, her distorted voice making the sound even more disturbing to anyone who heard it, and spend hours afterward unable to distinguish which memories were hers and which belonged to the thing that had worn her skin. The Medici prescribed various chemical suppressors to help manage the psychological trauma, drugs that would dull her emotional responses and make the memories less vivid. She took them for 3 days before throwing them away. The numbness they produced was worse than the pain. If she could not feel, if she could not hurt, then what separated her from the servitors that attended the medical bay? She would bear the full weight of what had happened to her, or she would not bear it at all. 6 weeks after the exorcism, the Medici declared her physically stable enough to be released from continuous medical supervision. Her bones had healed. Her internal organs had recovered as much as they were going to. The mutations had stabilized, showing no signs of progression or regression. She was, by the Medici's clinical assessment, as recovered as she would ever be. The Inquisitor visited her that evening, standing at the entrance to her recovery chamber like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "The Medici inform me you are ready to be discharged," he said without preamble, "which raises the question of what happens to you now. I am not inclined to simply release you. The knowledge you carry, the experience you have of possession from the inside, makes you too valuable to waste and too dangerous to allow to wander freely." "I want to return to my order," she said, knowing even as she spoke that it was impossible. "Your order believes you are dead," he reminded her. "And even if they did not, even if I revealed that you survived, they would not take you back. The taint of possession is absolute. You represent a vulnerability they cannot afford. More than that, you remind them that their faith, strong as it is, may not be enough to protect them from the warp. You are a walking challenge to their certainty, and they will not thank you for it." The truth of his words cut deeper than any physical injury. She had devoted her entire adult life to the Order of the Ebon Chalice. Every part of her identity had been built around being a sister of battle. To be told that she could never return, that she was now something other than what she had spent decades becoming, felt like being unmade. "Then what?" she asked. "What purpose do I serve if not as a battle sister?" The Inquisitor considered this for a moment. "That remains to be determined. For now, you will remain aboard this vessel while I complete my investigation of the cult activity on Tertius Prime. After that, we will see if your unique experience can be made useful. The Imperium has need of those who have survived possession, though the roles available to them are rarely pleasant and never glorious." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "One more thing. You will need a new name. Your old identity is dead, officially and permanently. Choose something that reflects what you have become. I will update the records accordingly." After he left, she sat in the sterile chamber and thought about names, about identity, about what remained of the person she had been. Sister Superior Catherine was dead. Her name entered in the Book of Martyrs. Her supposed sacrifice honored by the order she could never rejoin. The woman who remained needed a new designation, something that acknowledged the truth of her transformation. She chose to be called Penitent. It was a simple name, one that carried no rank or honor, that spoke only to a state of perpetual atonement for sins, both committed and inflicted upon her. It was the name of someone who had fallen from grace and now sought redemption through whatever means remained available. It was the name of someone who would spend the rest of her life, however long or short that might be, trying to atone for the simple fact of having survived when she should have died. It was the only name that felt true. The Path of Penance. The Inquisitor kept her aboard his vessel for another 4 months while he completed his investigation of Tertius Prime. During that time, she existed in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor free agent, neither useful nor disposable. He had her work with his retinue, performing tasks that required someone with military training but no official standing. She catalogued evidence of cult activity, cross-referenced reports of corruption with Imperial records, even accompanied his specialists on several occasions when they needed someone capable of handling weapons. She learned during those months about the broader world of the Inquisition and the shadow war it waged against chaos. It was not the clean, glorious crusade she had imagined as a battle sister. There were no hymns sung, no prayers offered before righteous battle. Instead, there was careful investigation, tedious analysis of data, and surgical application of violence when necessary. The Inquisition did not fight to inspire humanity's faith. It fought to preserve humanity's ignorance, to maintain the comfortable lies that allowed the average imperial citizen to sleep at night. Among the Inquisitor's retinue, she encountered others who had been marked by the warp in various ways. There was a former guardsman who had been exposed to chaos corruption during a campaign in the Eye of Terror, and now possessed the ability to sense demonic presence at a distance, though the talent cost him constant nightmares and occasional seizures. A tech priest who had recovered forbidden knowledge from a Dark Age data core, and now carried information in his augmetic memory that could drive normal humans insane if they attempted to access it. A sanctioned psyker whose control over her powers had been shattered by an encounter with warp entities, leaving her able to perform incredible feats of telekinesis, but at the risk of catastrophic psychic feedback. All of them were broken in some way. All of them carried scars that would never heal. And all of them had found a form of purpose in service to the Inquisition. They were tools, she realized. Weapons forged from the damaged remnants of people who should have died but survived through accident or force of will. The Inquisitor used them because they were effective, and because they had nowhere else to go. She was simply the newest addition to this collection of the damned. When the investigation finally concluded, and Tertius Prime was cleared for recolonization after extensive purification rites, the Inquisitor summoned her to his sanctum. The room was smaller than she expected, furnished simply with a desk and 2 chairs, the walls covered with files and data slates that represented decades of work hunting the Imperium's hidden enemies. "I have considered what to do with you," he said without preamble. "You are valuable, but you are also dangerous. The exercise tend toward one of 3 fates. They serve the Inquisition until they die on some mission, they lose their minds and require execution, or they seek death through some dramatic act of martyrdom. I would prefer to extract maximum utility from you before any of these outcomes occurs." "What would you have me do?" she asked, her distorted voice making the question sound like a threat. "For now, nothing. But I am returning to my investigations in the Calixis sector, and I am not in need of additional retinue at present. So I am remanding you to the custody of your former order, with specific instructions that you are to serve as a Sister Repentia." She felt the words like a physical blow. Repentia, the penitent warriors, those who had failed the Order's standards and now sought redemption through death in battle. They were outcasts, even within the Sisterhood, marked as failures, given the worst assignments and expected to die clearing minefields or absorbing enemy fire to protect their betters. "I thought you said they would not take me back," she managed to say. "They will not take you as a battle sister," he corrected. "But Repentia are different. They exist in a separate category, outside the normal hierarchy, useful but expendable. Your former canoness has agreed to accept you into the penitent ranks, though she was reluctant. You will serve under the supervision of a Repentia mistress, who will ensure you do not spread corruption among the faithful. And if you survive long enough to prove your redemption is genuine, perhaps they will grant you a cleaner death than most Repentia receive." "How long have I been sentenced to serve as Repentia?" she asked. The Inquisitor's expression might have been pity. "Until you die, or until I have need of you again. Whichever comes first. Do not expect it to be long. Repentia typically survive an average of 3 missions. Those with your particular complications rarely make it past the first." He handed her a data slate containing the official transfer documents, already sealed with the inquisitorial rosette. "A transport will take you to rejoin your order within the week. Collect whatever personal effects you wish to keep. Everything else will remain with my vessel." She had no personal effects. Everything she had owned as a battle sister was officially part of her martyred legacy, displayed in the Order's reliquaries or distributed to her former squad mates as memorial tokens. The armor she had worn during her possession had been destroyed, too contaminated by demonic taint to ever be purified. The weapons she had carried were lost or rendered unusable by the demon's abuse of her body. All she had was the simple robe they had given her during recovery, and the knowledge that she was about to be cast out among women who would remember her as someone who had died a hero, only to discover she had somehow survived as something less than human. The journey back to the Order's fortress monastery took 2 weeks, standard passage through the warp aboard a transport ship whose crew kept their distance from her. She spent the voyage in a bare cabin, preparing herself mentally for what awaited. She knew what Repentia were. She had served alongside them during her time as a battle sister, had watched them charge into impossible odds with nothing but faith and massive chain weapons, had seen them die by the dozens to accomplish objectives that would save the lives of properly armored battle sisters. She had pitied them once. Now she was one of them. The reunion with her order was everything she had feared it would be. The canoness received her in a private chamber, speaking to her through a vox system that allowed no physical proximity, as if even being in the same room might spread some contagion. The canoness's voice was cold, clinical, utterly devoid of the respect that had once existed between them. "Sister Superior Katerine is dead," the canoness stated flatly. "Her sacrifice is honored, and her name lives in our martyrology. You are someone else, someone who shares her memories, but lacks her purity. The Inquisition has commanded that we accept you as a repentia, and we will obey that command. But understand that you are here only by sufferance. You are tainted, you are corrupted, and if you show any sign that the demon's touch continues to influence you, you will be destroyed without hesitation." "I understand," she replied, her harmonically distorted voice making the words sound less certain than they were meant to be. "You will be assigned to Sister Repentia Mistress Cordelia. She specializes in difficult cases. You will obey her without question. You will speak of your possession to no one, and you will throw yourself into whatever battles we assign to you, with the understanding that death is the only redemption you can hope to achieve. Is this clear?" "Crystal clear, Canoness." "Good. Then present yourself to the penitent chambers. Your transformation begins immediately." The ritual of becoming a repentia was designed to be humiliating, to strip away any remaining pride or sense of accomplishment from those who had failed the Order's standards. She was forced to stand before the assembled battle sisters of her former company, while a priest of the Ministorum recited her sins. Not the sin of being possessed, which officially had never happened, but the sin of disobeying orders, of placing her personal judgment above the wisdom of her superiors, of allowing pride to override discipline. Each accusation was accompanied by a stroke from a neural whip, pain that did not damage flesh, but sent bolts of agony through her nervous system. By the time the litany was complete, she was on her knees, shaking from the accumulated torment, while her former comrades watched with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust. Then came the disrobing. Her clothing, what little she had been allowed to wear, was stripped away. In its place, she was given the minimal garments of a repentia, reinforced leather bindings that covered only what modesty absolutely required, leaving most of her body exposed to enemy fire. Red cloth was wrapped around her in specific patterns, both to mark her as a penitent and to create attachment points for equipment she would need to carry. Her head was shaved, the long hair she had maintained since entering the convent cut away until only stubble remained. A brand was placed upon her forehead, the symbol of the repentia burning itself into her skin while she bit back screams. This mark would identify her as one seeking redemption through death, a warning to all who saw her that this was a woman who had failed and now sought to atone. Finally, she was given her weapon. Not a bolter or flamer, the sanctified instruments she had mastered over years of training. Instead, a massive eviscerator, a chain weapon the size of a grown man, designed for close combat and requiring 2 hands to wield effectively. It was an inelegant weapon, brutal and exhausting to use, but devastating against anything it connected with. This would be her only tool, her only protection, for however long she survived as a repentia. Sister Repentia. Mistress Cordelia stepped forward once the ritual was complete. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, her face marked by scars that spoke of decades of combat, her eyes hard and utterly without mercy. In her hands she carried neural whips, the weapons that would drive the repentia forward in battle and punish any who showed hesitation. "You are penitent," Cordelia said, not making it a question. "That is your name now. Your past identity is dead. Your accomplishments mean nothing. You exist only to seek redemption through service and ultimately death. Do you understand your purpose?" I understand, mistress. We will see. Many think they understand, but few truly embrace what it means to be repentia. You will learn, one way or another. She gestured toward a group of perhaps 20 other women, all marked as repentia, all standing at attention despite their lack of armor or proper clothing. These are your sisters in penance. You will fight beside them. You will likely die beside them, but you will not speak to them of your past, and they will not speak to you of theirs. Only the present matters. Only redemption matters. Is this clear? Yes, mistress. Cordelia nodded, then without warning lashed out with one of her neural whips. The crackling energy wrapped around Penitent's torso, sending jolts of agony through her body that made her cry out despite her best efforts at control. The harmonics in her voice made the scream sound inhuman, and she saw several of the other repentia flinch away from the sound. That, Cordelia said calmly, coiling the whip back, was to remind you that pain is your constant companion now. Embrace it. Let it burn away your failings. Let it forge you into something that might be worthy of the Emperor's grace once more. She was assigned to the Penitent Barracks, a section of the fortress monastery deliberately isolated from where the Battle Sisters lived. The accommodations were Spartan, even by the Order's generally austere standards. Stone floors, no heating beyond what body warmth and braziers could provide, sleeping mats instead of proper beds. The repentia were not meant to be comfortable. They were meant to suffer, to feel the weight of their failures with every breath they took. That first night, lying on her mat while the other repentia maintained careful distance from her, Penitent realized the full magnitude of her fall. She had been a sister superior, a respected leader within the Order, someone whose voice carried weight when tactics were discussed. Now she was less than the newest novitiate, marked as so fundamentally flawed that she could not be trusted with power armor or ranged weapons. But more than that, she realized that she was alone in a way that went beyond physical isolation. The other repentia at least shared the understanding that they had failed through some specific action, some moment of weakness that could be defined and atoned for. She carried knowledge they did not have, had experienced horrors they could not imagine, and wore marks that set her apart even among the damned. She was the woman who had been possessed and survived, and that made her something unique in a way that offered no comfort whatsoever. Ostracization and isolation. If Penitent had hoped that serving as a repentia among others seeking redemption might provide some sense of community, that hope was swiftly crushed. The other members of her Penitent squad treated her with open wariness bordering on hostility, maintaining physical distance whenever possible and speaking to her only when absolutely necessary. It took her several days to understand why the ostracization was so complete, even by the standards of the repentia's deliberately isolated existence. Word had spread, despite the canoness's orders for silence, that she was not merely a repentia who had failed through ordinary means. Whispers passed through the fortress monastery, growing more distorted with each retelling, until the story bore only tangential resemblance to truth. She was possessed, some said. She had willingly opened herself to demonic forces. She had murdered battle sisters while wearing their holy armor. She was tainted beyond redemption, but kept alive for reasons no one fully understood. The rumors were impossible to completely suppress because too many people had witnessed her return. The battle sisters who had seen her arrive, marked with mutations no amount of covering could completely hide. The Medicae servitors whose data cores contained detailed records of her condition. The canoness herself, who had made the decision to accept her back despite every protocol suggesting she should have been executed. In the Penitent Barracks, the effect was immediate and total. When she entered a room, conversations stopped. When she took her place in the prayer formations, the repentia to either side would edge away, leaving gaps in the otherwise tightly packed ranks. During meals, which consisted of simple rations taken communally, she found herself alone at the end of the table, other penitents choosing to crowd together rather than risk proximity to her. Sister Repentia. Mistress Cordelia observed all of this without comment or intervention. The isolation was, Penitent eventually realized, deliberate. It was part of the penance, part of the process of stripping away any remaining attachment to the world and forcing the penitent to find solace only in the Emperor's distant regard. If the other Repentia would not offer even the bare comfort of companionship, then she would have to learn to exist entirely within her own faith, or she would break. That was always an option. The training regimen for Repentia was designed to prepare them for their role as shock troops and living shields. Where battle sisters trained to fight as coordinated units with combined arms support, Repentia were taught to simply charge forward and overwhelm the enemy through sheer ferocity and willingness to accept casualties. The sessions were brutal, pushing the penitents to exhaustion and beyond, breaking bodies that would not be protected by power armor and testing faith that had already been found wanting. Penitent threw herself into the training with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. Part of it was genuine desire to atone, to prove that she could still be useful despite the taint she carried. But part of it was simply the need to exhaust herself so completely that sleep would come before the nightmares had time to fully manifest. If she could just push her body hard enough, if she could pour all her focus into mastering the massive eviscerator and the brutal tactics of Repentia combat, then perhaps she could avoid thinking about what had been done to her and what she had become. The eviscerator was a weapon unlike anything she had used before. Where a bolter required precision and careful ammunition management, where a flamer needed positioning and timing, the eviscerator demanded only commitment. You pointed it at the enemy and charged, letting the weapon's own weight and momentum carry it through whatever stood in your path. It was exhausting, requiring constant muscle tension just to control the massive blade, but it was also oddly liberating. There was no subtlety, no tactical complexity, just faith and fury, and the hope that the Emperor would guide your strike true. Cordelia watched her train, occasionally offering corrections, but more often, simply observing. After 2 weeks of this pattern, the mistress finally called her aside, following a particularly grueling session. "You fight well," Cordelia said without preamble. "Better than most who come to us as Repentia. You have training that shows in your movements, muscle memory from years of proper service." "Thank you, mistress," Penitent replied, her distorted voice making even simple gratitude sound strange. "I was not giving a compliment. I was stating an observation that leads to a question. Why are you here? Most Repentia come to us because they failed in combat, or showed cowardice, or disobeyed orders in ways that got their sisters killed. But you, the file the Inquisition provided says only that you are to serve in penance until either death or recall. It does not specify your actual sin." Penitent hesitated, remembering the canoness's command that she speak of the possession to no one. But Cordelia was her superior in this context, and perhaps understanding the truth would help explain the isolation that was making her service so much more difficult than it needed to be. "I was possessed, mistress. A demon took control of my body during a mission. The Inquisition managed to exorcise it, but the taint remains. That is why I am here. That is why the others fear me." Cordelia was silent for a long moment, studying her with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by any revelation. "Possessed," she finally said, "and survived the exorcism. I have heard of such things, though never witnessed one. The exorcised, they are called in certain texts. Most die within months of the ritual, either from complications of the process or because they choose death over living with the memories. I am aware of the statistics, mistress. Yet you chose to live. That takes a particular kind of courage, or a particular kind of arrogance. Which is it?" The question was not rhetorical. Cordelia genuinely wanted to know, and Penitent found herself considering it carefully before answering. "I don't know, mistress. In the moment, when the Inquisitor offered me the choice, I told myself it was faith that made me choose life. The belief that the Emperor must have a purpose for my survival, that there must be some reason I was not allowed to die. But in the months since, I have wondered if it was simply cowardice, fear of the final judgment, of facing the Emperor's throne while carrying the stain of having been a demon's vessel. Cordelia nodded slowly. That is an honest answer, more honest than most would give. Let me tell you something about the Repentia penitent. Every woman here is asking herself the same question. Is she seeking redemption out of faith, or is she simply too afraid to die without attempting to make amends? The answer does not matter as much as you think it does. What matters is the service, the commitment to throw yourself into battle, knowing you likely will not survive it. The Emperor judges our actions, not our motivations. He sees the deeds, not the doubts. Does that make it easier, mistress, knowing that doubt is acceptable? No, it makes it harder, because it means you cannot use certainty as a crutch. You must act despite the doubt, must maintain faith even when you question everything. That is what separates true faith from blind obedience. Over the following weeks, Penitent found herself having regular conversations with Cordelia after training sessions. The mistress, she discovered, had served as a battle sister for 30 years before being assigned to shepherd the Repentia, and she had seen more examples of how faith could fail than most within the order wanted to acknowledge. She did not soften the harshness of the training or offer comfort when Penitent struggled, but she listened, and she offered perspective that came from decades of watching women seek redemption in the only way the order allowed. These conversations became one of the few anchors in Penitent's existence, moments when she could speak honestly without fear that her words would be reported to the canoness or used as evidence of ongoing corruption. Cordelia knew what she was, knew the truth of her possession and survival, and treated her no differently than any other Repentia under her supervision. The mistress did not fear her, did not maintain distance, did not act as if proximity might spread some contagion. It was the closest thing to normalcy Penitent had experienced since her possession, but even that small comfort came at a price. The other Repentia noticed Cordelia's willingness to engage with her, and it only deepened their suspicion. If the mistress was willing to speak with the tainted one, then perhaps the taint was spreading, perhaps they were all at risk. The isolation intensified, and Penitent found herself even more alone than before. The isolation became particularly stark during prayer and devotional hours. The Repentia spent hours each day in religious observance, seeking the Emperor's forgiveness through endless recitation of litanies and meditations on the lives of martyrs. Normally, these sessions were communal, voices joining in harmony as the penitents collectively begged for redemption. But when Penitent attempted to join her voice to theirs, the other Repentia would fall silent, disrupting the rhythm of the prayer until she stopped speaking. After the third time this happened, she simply stopped trying to participate verbally. Instead, she would mouth the words silently while the others prayed, maintaining the forms of devotion, while accepting that her voice, with its demon-inflicted harmonics, was too disturbing to be included in communal worship. This exclusion from even the religious life of the Repentia cut deeper than the physical isolation. Prayer had always been her anchor, the one constant throughout her life, from the Schola Progenium through her service as a battle sister. To be told, implicitly, but unmistakably, that even her prayers were unwelcome felt like being denied the one tool she had to maintain her sanity. She began praying alone, finding empty chambers or isolated corners of the fortress monastery where she could speak the words that sustained her without disturbing others. These solo devotions became increasingly important to her mental stability, hours spent in the darkness speaking to an emperor who might or might not be listening, begging for the strength to endure another day as an outcast among the already outcast. It was during one of these solo prayer sessions that she encountered the first person outside of Cordelia who seemed willing to acknowledge her existence without fear or hostility. She had found a small chapel in the depths of the fortress monastery, a space so old that its original purpose had been forgotten, maintained now only by ancient cleaning servitors whose programming demanded they continue polishing stone that no one ever saw. She was kneeling before the small altar, whispering the litany of faith, when she heard footsteps behind her. Expecting Cordelia, or perhaps a battle sister come to tell her this space was off limits to Repentia, she turned to find instead a young novitiate, perhaps 16 years old, carrying a pail of sacred water for the ablutions. The girl froze when she saw Penitent, her eyes going wide with something between fear and curiosity. For a moment, neither spoke, both waiting to see what the other would do. "I'm sorry," the novitiate finally said. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I'll come back later to refresh the fonts." "Don't leave on my account," Penitent replied, then immediately regretted speaking when she saw the girl flinch at the harmonics in her voice. The chapel was empty, and I needed somewhere quiet to pray." The novitiate set down her pail, but didn't move toward the altar. "You're the Repentia they brought back from death, aren't you? The one who came back wrong." "That's one way to describe it." Penitent rose from her kneeling position, preparing to leave and spare the girl any further discomfort. "I should go. I'm disturbing your duties." "Wait." The word came out sharper than the novitiate probably intended, and she softened her tone before continuing. "I'm sorry. That was rude of me. It's just the other novitiates. We've heard stories that you were touched by chaos but survived, that the Inquisition did something to you, that you're dangerous but the Canoness has to keep you because of some agreement with the Ordo Malleus. Most of that is true in one form or another. Are you dangerous?" The question was direct, without judgment, genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Penitent considered how to answer that. She could lie, could reassure this young woman that she posed no threat. But lies felt like another form of corruption, and she had sworn to herself that whatever else she became, she would not add deception to her list of failings. "I don't know," she admitted. "The demon that possessed me was exorcised, and I have shown no signs of repossession in the months since, but the experience changed me in ways I don't fully understand. I hear whispers sometimes, echoes that might be memories of the demon's voice or might be new corruption taking root. So yes, I might be dangerous. I try not to be, but I honestly don't know if I would recognize the signs if I was falling." The novitiate absorbed this answer, her young face showing the kind of careful thought that suggested she would make a good battle sister if she survived her training. "Then why did they keep you alive? If you might be corrupted, why not just execute you and be certain?" "Because I am also possibly useful. The Inquisition believes that my experience might help them understand possession better, might give them tools to fight it in others. And because killing me would mean admitting that faith alone was not enough to save me, which would raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of the Emperor's protection. That's complicated. Everything involving chaos is complicated. That's part of what makes it so dangerous." They stood in silence for a moment, and Penitent prepared to leave, certain that she had said too much, that this girl would now report the conversation and she would face additional punishment for discussing forbidden topics with a novitiate. But before she could move toward the exit, the girl spoke again. "My name is Elaine. I'm in my 3rd year of training with the Order. If you need someone to talk to, someone who isn't afraid of you, I come here most evenings to maintain the chapel. You could come too if you wanted. To pray, Not to talk necessarily, but just... You wouldn't have to be alone." The offer was so unexpected, so utterly contrary to everything Penitent had experienced since her return, that she felt tears forming in her altered eyes. "Why would you risk that? Association with me could taint you by proximity. Other novitiates would shun you. Your superiors might question your judgment." Elaine smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something much younger and more hopeful. "The Emperor teaches us to care for the least among us, to show mercy to those who suffer. If I abandon that principle because it's difficult or risky, what kind of sister will I become? Besides, you look like you could use a friend. Even if we're just 2 people praying in the same space without speaking, that's less lonely than praying completely alone. You barely know me. I could be lying about everything. I could still be possessed, pretending to be redeemed while spreading corruption. Then I guess I'm taking that risk. The canoness wouldn't have allowed you to remain if she thought you were an active threat. That's good enough for me. Penitent wanted to warn her, to explain all the reasons this was a terrible idea, to protect this naive young woman from the potential consequences of showing kindness to someone marked as irredeemably tainted. But she also desperately wanted to accept, to have even one person in this fortress monastery who looked at her with something other than fear or disgust. "I will come," she said finally. "Not every evening, but sometimes. And we will pray, and perhaps occasionally talk if you feel it is safe to do so. But Elaine, if you ever feel uncomfortable, if you ever sense that something is wrong, you tell your superiors immediately. Promise me that." "I promise. Now, I should finish my duties before evening prayer begins. Will you be here tomorrow?" "Perhaps. We'll see what the training schedule allows." After the novitiate left, Penitent remained in the chapel for another hour, her mind churning through this unexpected development. She knew she should refuse future meetings, should protect the girl by maintaining distance. But the simple human connection, the first genuine kindness she had been shown since the exorcism, felt like water to someone dying of thirst. She would accept the offered friendship, she decided. She would be careful, would watch herself for any signs of corruption that might spread to the novitiate. But she would not reject this one small grace that the Emperor, or chance, or some combination of both, had placed in her path. Even the damned need reasons to continue existing. Even those seeking redemption through death need anchors that make them want to survive long enough to earn that redemption. Elaine had become that anchor, perhaps without fully realizing what she was offering. And Penitent would do everything in her power to ensure that kindness did not become the girl's downfall. The inner battle. Every morning, Penitent woke from nightmares she could barely remember, but whose emotional residue clung to her consciousness like oil. The demon's voice, or something that sounded like the demon's voice, or perhaps just her own fears given sound, whispered in the space between sleep and waking. Always the same message, variations on a single theme. You are mine. You were always mine. The exorcism changed nothing. I left pieces of myself behind, seeds planted deep in your soul, waiting to sprout when the moment is right. She had learned not to fully trust these whispers. The Medici and the Inquisitor had both assured her that the daemon had been completely expelled, that what she was experiencing was trauma rather than ongoing possession. The human mind, when subjected to something as fundamentally wrong as demonic invasion, did not simply recover. It created patterns, echoes, phantom sensations that mimicked the original horror, because that was how consciousness processed trauma, too great to be properly integrated. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally were different things. And the whispers felt so real, so much like the demon's actual voice during the possession, that she could never quite convince herself they were only echoes. The constant vigilance required to monitor herself for signs of corruption became a full-time occupation layered beneath everything else she did. While training with the Eviscerator, part of her attention was always focused inward, checking whether her reactions felt natural or influenced. While praying, she analyzed every thought for anything that might indicate the demon's touch. While lying awake in the pre-dawn hours, she went through mental exercises designed to detect the presence of foreign consciousness, techniques the Inquisitor had taught her during her recovery. So far, she had found nothing concrete, but the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, and she knew that chaos was infinitely patient, willing to wait years or decades for the perfect moment to spring whatever trap it had laid. The most terrifying aspect of this internal vigil was the uncertainty about what she was guarding against. If the demon had left something behind, some fragment of itself embedded so deeply in her psyche that the exorcism could not reach it, what form would that contamination take? Would it be obvious, a sudden urge to commit heresy or betray the Emperor? Or would it be subtle, a gradual erosion of her faith so gentle she would not notice until it was far too late? Cordelia noticed her increasing distraction during training sessions and finally pulled her aside after she botched a basic drill that she should have been able to execute in her sleep. "You're fighting yourself as much as you're fighting the training," the mistress observed, not making it an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Your mind is somewhere else. That will get you killed when we deploy, probably within the first minutes of combat." "I apologize, mistress. I will focus better." "That's not an answer. I asked you to explain, not to promise improvement." Cordelia studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who had broken countless warriors down to their component fears and rebuilt them into something functional. "What is occupying your thoughts so completely that you cannot maintain attention on the present?" Penitent hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only option. "I am monitoring myself for signs of corruption, mistress. The demon was exorcised, but I cannot be certain it did not leave something behind. Every thought I have, every emotion I feel, I must question whether it originates from me or from some lingering taint. The effort of maintaining this vigilance is exhausting." "Of course it is. You are attempting the impossible." Cordelia gestured for her to sit, an unusual break in the normal formality of their interactions. "Listen carefully, penitent, because I'm going to tell you something that will probably not comfort you, but which is nevertheless true. You cannot monitor yourself for corruption. It is like trying to examine your own eyes without a mirror. Chaos is infinitely subtle. If something was left behind by the demon, if you are slowly being corrupted, you will be the last person to know, because your very ability to judge yourself will be compromised by the corruption." "Then what do I do? Just accept that I might be a vector for heresy and hope someone kills me before the corruption manifests?" "No. You trust the Emperor, and you trust the systems the Imperium has built to identify such contamination. You have psychers examining you regularly, yes?" "The Inquisitor arranged for monthly evaluations, yes." "And they have detected nothing?" "Not so far." "Then stop second-guessing them. The sanctioned psychers who serve the Ordo Malleus are trained specifically to detect the presence of chaos corruption. If they say you are clean, you are clean. You are not smarter than them. You are not more perceptive than them. You are simply traumatized, and your trauma is making you see threats that do not exist." "But what if they're wrong? What if I am corrupted, and they simply cannot detect it?" Cordelia leaned forward, her scarred face intense with conviction. "Then you die and go to stand before the Emperor's judgment. That is the worst-case scenario. But torturing yourself with paranoia accomplishes nothing except making you less effective in your actual purpose, which is seeking redemption through service. The Emperor knows your heart, penitent. He knows whether you are corrupted or not. You do not need to know. You only need to serve until either redemption or death claims you." The logic was brutal but sound. Penitent had been tying herself in mental knots, trying to prove her own purity, when the entire concept was based on a fundamental impossibility. She could not objectively assess herself. She had to either trust the people whose job it was to detect corruption, or she had to drive herself insane with constant self-examination that would never produce definitive answers. "How do I stop?" she asked. "The vigilance has become automatic. I don't know how to turn it off." "You don't turn it off. You redirect it. Every time you catch yourself analyzing your thoughts for corruption, force yourself to instead recite a prayer. Channel that obsessive attention outward toward the Emperor, rather than inward toward your own fears. It won't be easy. You've built a habit over months, and habits are not broken quickly. But if you commit to this discipline, eventually the pattern will shift." Penitent began implementing this suggestion that same day. Every time she found herself wondering whether a thought was truly hers or influenced by demonic taint, she forced herself to recite the litany of purity. Every time she questioned whether her faith was genuine or a mask covering corruption, she spoke the words of the devotional of trust. "I am the Emperor's servant. He guides my path. I need not question his will, only obey it." The technique worked, though not quickly and not completely. For the first week, she felt like she was reciting prayers constantly, her entire conscious existence reduced to an endless stream of religious verse designed to crowd out the paranoid questioning that had dominated her thoughts. But gradually, the balance shifted. The automatic self-examination came less frequently, and when it did occur, the habit of replacing it with prayer had become strong enough to override the impulse. She still had moments of doubt. Lying awake in the dark, listening to the other repentia breathe in their sleep, she would find herself questioning everything. But those moments became the exception rather than the rule, and she learned to accept them as part of the price of her survival rather than evidence of ongoing corruption. The dreams, however, were another matter entirely. Every night, or nearly every night, she dreamed of the possession. The specifics varied, but the core experience remained constant. The sensation of something forcing its way into her consciousness, the horror of watching her own hands commit atrocities, the demon's laughter echoing through her mind while she screamed silently inside her own skull. Sometimes the dreams mixed memory with imagination, creating scenarios that had not happened, but which felt absolutely real. She dreamed of killing Elaine, of murdering the kind novitiate who had offered friendship. She dreamed of leading the other repentia into traps, of spreading corruption throughout the fortress monastery, of betraying the emperor in ways so fundamental that her soul was damned beyond any possibility of redemption. These nightmares were worse than the actual memories of possession, because they raised the horrifying question: were these just dreams, or were they premonitions? Was her subconscious trying to warn her about corruption that the psychers had not yet detected? Or were they simply the natural result of trauma, her mind processing horror by generating new variations on the original theme? She had no way to know, and that uncertainty was its own special torment. After a particularly bad nightmare left her screaming herself awake, Penitent sought out Cordelia outside of normal training hours. She found the mistress in her private quarters, a small cell barely larger than the one assigned to the repentia, but distinguished by the presence of books and reliquaries accumulated over decades of service. "The nightmares are getting worse," Penitent said without preamble. "I'm afraid to sleep. When I do manage to rest, I wake up not entirely certain which memories are real and which are products of trauma." Cordelia set aside the ancient text she had been studying, her expression thoughtful. The exercised often report similar experiences. The mind attempts to process trauma by replaying it, by creating variations, by trying to find patterns that might help predict future danger. It is not evidence of corruption. It is evidence that you are human, and your consciousness is functioning exactly as human consciousness does when confronted with horror beyond normal parameters. How long does it continue? For most exercised, until they die, which, as I mentioned before, is rarely long. The combination of psychological trauma, physical mutations, and the high-risk missions they're typically assigned means most don't survive past a year. You've already beaten the average by several months. The casual way Cordelia delivered this information should have been disturbing, but Penitent found it oddly comforting. There was no false hope, no pretense that things would magically improve, just brutal honesty about what awaited her. "The Inquisitor told me there were only 4 other survivors of exorcism in his records," Penitent said. "Do you know what happened to them?" "2 are dead. 1 serves in his retinue still, though from what I understand she is not entirely sane. The 4th disappeared into the underhive of some hive world and is presumed dead, though no body was ever recovered. So yes, your chances of long-term survival are essentially non-existent. But you knew that when you chose to live." "I did." Penitent was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been haunting her. "Mistress, do you think the Emperor has a purpose for me? Or did I survive simply through random chance and stubbornness?" Cordelia smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Does it matter? Either way, you are alive, and you have a duty to serve until death releases you. Whether that service fulfills some grand purpose, or is simply the thrashing of a dying woman trying to make her final months mean something, is irrelevant. The Emperor judges our actions, not our cosmic significance." "That's a bleak philosophy." It's the only philosophy that allows someone like you or me to function. We are not heroes, penitent. We are not chosen warriors blessed by divine favor. We are broken tools that still have some marginal utility before we're discarded. Accept that, embrace that, and you'll find peace in the service itself, rather than constantly searching for meaning that may not exist. The conversation ended shortly after, but Cordelia's words stayed with Penitent through the following weeks. The mistress was right. She had been spending too much energy trying to find purpose in her survival, trying to convince herself that the Emperor had saved her for some grand destiny. The reality was probably much simpler and much less comforting. She had survived through a combination of circumstances. Her possession had been recent enough for exorcism to work, and now she existed in the liminal space between death and purpose until one or the other claimed her. That should have been depressing. Instead, she found it liberating. If she had no grand destiny to fulfill, if her survival meant nothing beyond the simple fact of continued existence, then she was free to simply be what she was, a penitent warrior seeking redemption through whatever service remained, available to her. The nightmares continued. The whispers in the moments between sleep and waking persisted. The constant awareness of her mutations, the way other people looked at her, the knowledge that she was tainted beyond full recovery, all of these remained, but they no longer paralyzed her. They were simply facts of her existence, conditions to be managed rather than problems to be solved. She learned to function with the dreams, to wake from nightmares and immediately begin reciting prayers until her heart rate calmed and reality reasserted itself. She learned to ignore the whispers, recognizing them as echoes rather than active threats. She learned to exist in her altered body, to accept the mutations as permanent features rather than temporary afflictions that might be cured. Most importantly, she learned to separate her trauma from her identity. She was not the possessed sister who survived. She was penitent, a repentia seeking redemption through service. The possession was part of her history, an experience that had shaped her, but it was not the totality of who she was. This shift in perspective did not happen quickly or easily. It required months of conscious effort, of catching herself when she fell into old patterns of obsessive self-examination, of choosing to define herself by her present actions rather than her past failures. But gradually, incrementally, she found herself spending less time trapped in memory and more time engaged with the actual reality of her existence. The friendship with Elaine helped. The young novitiate continued to meet her in the forgotten chapel several times a week, and though their conversations remained carefully superficial, the simple human connection provided an anchor that nothing else could. Elaine spoke of her training, her hopes for eventual acceptance as a full battle sister, her struggles with particular aspects of the curriculum. Penitent listened and occasionally offered advice based on her own experience, careful to never discuss the possession, but willing to share the tactical and spiritual insights she had accumulated over years of service. These conversations reminded her that life existed beyond trauma and penance, that somewhere in the Imperium, young women were training to serve the Emperor without carrying the weight of demonic taint. That normal existence, as brutal as it was by any reasonable standard, was still possible for some people, even if it would never be possible for her again. The inner battle would never be fully won. Penitent understood that now. She would carry the scars of possession, both physical and psychological, until death finally claimed her. But she could choose how those scars defined her. She could be the broken thing destroyed by what had been done to her, or she could be the survivor who kept fighting despite the damage. She chose to keep fighting. Redemption and purpose. The call to actual combat came 4 months after Penitent joined the Repentia. The order received an urgent request for aid from an Imperial Guard regiment besieging a fortress occupied by heretics on a world whose name was classified even in the briefing documents. The enemy had fortified their position thoroughly, and breaking through would require troops willing to absorb casualties while breaching the walls. The Repentia were the perfect tool for such a mission. Cordelia delivered the briefing in the penitent barracks, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. This is what you have been training for. Tomorrow, we deploy to the combat zone. Your mission is simple. Breach the fortress walls and create an opening for the battle sisters to follow. Many of you will not survive. That is acceptable. That is, in fact, the purpose of your service. You will die so that others may live and complete the Emperor's work. This is your chance at redemption. The other Repentia received this news with grim acceptance. They had known this moment was coming. The training had been preparation for the only end that awaited them, death in service to the Emperor, hopefully glorious enough to atone for whatever failures had brought them to the penitent ranks. Penitent felt something different, not fear exactly, though there was certainly an element of that, but also anticipation. For months, she had existed in a state of suspended animation, training without purpose, seeking redemption without knowing if it was possible for someone as tainted as her. Now, finally, she would have the opportunity to prove that she could still serve, that the possession had not rendered her completely useless. That night, she visited the chapel one last time. Elaine was there, as she usually was in the evenings, performing the small maintenance tasks that kept the space sanctified. "We deploy tomorrow," Penitent said without preamble. "I wanted to thank you for the conversations, for treating me like a person, rather than a contamination to be avoided." Elaine set down her cleaning implements, her young face suddenly serious. "You're not coming back, are you?" "Probably not. The survival rate for Repentia in assault missions is poor, and I am not at my physical peak, despite the training. The mutations make certain movements difficult, and the psychological burden." She trailed off, not wanting to burden the girl with details that would serve no purpose. "I'll pray for you, for your survival and for your redemption, whichever the Emperor sees fit to grant." "Thank you. That means more than you know." Penitent hesitated, then decided to speak the thought that had been forming over the past weeks. "Elaine, when you complete your training, when you become a full battle sister, remember that faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the choice to serve despite the doubt. The most faithful warriors are not those who never question, but those who question and choose to believe anyway." "Where did you learn that?" "From being possessed by something that tried to destroy my faith, and discovering that even stripped down to nothing, even reduced to screaming silence in my own skull, I still chose to believe in the Emperor. That's when I understood that faith is not a feeling or a certainty. It is a decision you make every moment of every day." They prayed together for the last time, their voices joining in the familiar litanies that had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years. When Penitent left the chapel, she felt a sense of completion that she had not experienced since before the possession. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had done what she could to prepare, both physically and spiritually. The deployment began before dawn. The Repentia were loaded into dropships alongside their battle sister counterparts, though kept in separate compartments as befitted their lower status. Cordelia moved among them, applying the ritual lashes from her neural whips that were meant to focus their minds on their duty and remind them of the pain they deserved for their failures. When the whip touched Penitent's back, sending jolts of agony through her nervous system, she welcomed it. The pain was clarifying, burning away the last traces of fear and doubt. By the time Cordelia had finished her rounds, every Repentia was vibrating with barely contained fury and religious fervor, ready to throw themselves at the enemy with total commitment. The descent through the planet's atmosphere was rough, anti-aircraft fire filling the sky with explosions that rocked their transport. Penitent gripped her eviscerator, feeling the weapon's weight as both burden and promise. This blade would be her tool of redemption. It would kill the Emperor's enemies and probably see her own death in the process. Both outcomes were acceptable. The landing zone was a cratered wasteland a kilometer from the fortress walls. As the Repentia deployed, they could see the defenses that awaited them. Reinforced walls studded with heavy weapons, kill zones designed to channel attackers into areas of concentrated fire, trenches filled with enemies who had spent weeks preparing for this assault. Cordelia stood before them, her neural whips raised. Repentia! Today you prove your worth. Today you wash away your sins in the blood of heretics. Charge forward and do not stop until you breach those walls or die in the attempt. The Emperor watches. Show him you are worthy of his regard. The order came. Advance. And the Repentia charged. What followed was chaos in its purest form. They ran across open ground while heavy bolters and autocannons tore through their ranks. Penitent saw the women to her left and right cut down, their bodies shredded by fire too concentrated to avoid. But she kept running, the eviscerator held ready, her voice raised in a hymn that her distorted vocal cords turned into something between prayer and war cry. The Emperor protects, she sang as explosions threw dirt and worse into the air around her. His light guides me through darkness. A woman beside her took a direct hit from a crack missile and simply ceased to exist, reduced to red mist and scattered fragments. Penitent kept running. His strength sustains me when mine fails. The ground beneath her feet became slick with blood, the bodies of her sister Repentia forming obstacles that had to be vaulted or trampled. I fear no evil. She reached the outer trench and leapt down, her eviscerator already swinging, the roaring blade finding heretic flesh and tearing through it with brutal efficiency. For he is with me always. The melee in the trenches was the kind of close-quarters nightmare that her training had prepared her for. There was no room for tactics or sophisticated maneuvers, just raw violence, eviscerator against autogun and improvised weapons, faith against heresy, determination against desperation. She killed without counting, without thinking, letting her body move through the patterns drilled into her over months of brutal training. The eviscerator was an extension of her will, and her will was focused on one thing: forward. Always forward. Through the trenches, over the bodies of friend and foe alike, toward the fortress walls that represented either redemption or death. At some point during the assault, she took a hit to her left shoulder, a lace round that burned through skin and muscle. She barely noticed. The pain was distant, less real than the religious fervor that drove her forward. Another round grazed her temple, close enough that she felt the heat, but far enough that it left her functional. The Emperor protects, she reminded herself, and kept moving. By the time she reached the base of the fortress wall, perhaps a quarter of the Repentia who had begun the charge were still alive. They had created the breach they were ordered to create, carving a path through the outer defenses that the Battle Sisters could now exploit. Behind them, she could hear the distinctive sound of bolter fire as properly armored warriors advanced through the gap the Repentia had paid for with their lives. "Breach charges!" Cordelia's voice cut through the chaos, and the few surviving Repentia who carried the sacred explosives moved to place them against the wall. Penitent provided covering fire, with the only ranged weapon available to her, a bolt pistol scavenged from a fallen battle sister, while the charges were set and blessed. The explosion was tremendous, rock and ceramite reduced to fragments that peppered everyone nearby. When the smoke cleared, a ragged hole had been torn in the fortress wall, large enough for troops to pour through. "Into the breach," Cordelia commanded, and the Repentia charged again, eviscerators roaring as they met the heretics who rushed to defend the gap. The fighting inside the fortress was even more brutal than the approach had been. Narrow corridors designed for defense became killing grounds where the Repentia's willingness to accept casualties proved decisive. They absorbed fire that should have decimated their numbers, pushed forward through defenses that should have held, created openings that the Battle Sisters following behind could exploit with their superior equipment and training. Penitent fought like a woman who had already died and simply hadn't stopped moving yet. She took hits that would have killed her if her altered biology hadn't made her slightly more resilient than normal humans. She pushed past exhaustion into some state beyond pain, where only momentum and faith sustained her, and she killed over and over until her eviscerator's blade was slick with blood and her arms trembled from the effort of swinging the massive weapon. At some point, She realized that Cordelia was fighting beside her, the mistress having abandoned her role as commander to join the melee directly. Even as she watched, Cordelia took a bolt round to the abdomen, the mass-reactive shell detonating inside her body. The mistress staggered, but did not fall, her neural whips lashing out to kill the heretic who had shot her. "Mistress!" Penitent tried to reach her superior, but the press of combat made movement difficult. "Keep going!" Cordelia's voice was weakening, blood pouring from the catastrophic wound. Redemption is forward, not back. Those were the last words Cordelia spoke. She collapsed, and the tide of battle swept forward, leaving her body behind along with so many others who had fallen in this assault. Penitent wanted to stop, wanted to honor the woman who had been the closest thing to a mentor she'd had since the possession. But Cordelia's final command had been clear. Forward. Always forward. Redemption was not found in mourning the dead, but in completing the mission they had died to achieve. She pushed deeper into the fortress, part of a dwindling group of Repentia who had survived this long through luck and stubbornness. The Battle Sisters were fully engaged now, their bolters and flamers clearing rooms with professional efficiency. The Repentia had served their purpose. They had created the breach and absorbed the initial counterattack. What remained of them continued to fight, because stopping would mean acknowledging the deaths of those who had fallen, and that acknowledgement would come later if they survived. The fortress's inner sanctum, where the cult's leadership had established their command center, was defended by heretics who had fully given themselves to chaos. Their bodies showed mutations that made Penitent's alterations look subtle by comparison. They fought with a ferocity born of knowing they had nothing to lose, that capture meant torture and execution. It was in this final battle that Penitent found her redemption, though not in the form she had expected. A child emerged from a side chamber, a girl perhaps 10 years old, her eyes wide with terror. She wore civilian clothing, simple fabrics that suggested she was not one of the cultists, but rather a hostage or victim. As Penitent watched, a mutated heretic raised a blade to kill the child, either out of spite or to use her as a shield. Without thinking, Penitent threw herself between them. Her eviscerator caught the heretic's blow, the massive blade easily overpowering the smaller weapon. With a twist and thrust, she ended the heretic's life, then positioned herself between the child and any other threats. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her distorted voice making the words sound harsh despite her intent to reassure. "I will protect you." The child nodded, too terrified to do anything but obey. And for the next 10 minutes, while the battle raged around them, Penitent fought with a purpose beyond simple redemption. She was protecting an innocent, using her tainted body and corrupted voice and demon-marked soul to shield someone who represented everything she had once fought for. She took wounds defending that position. A blade opened a gash across her ribs, a stub pistol round lodged in her thigh. Her altered physiology kept her functional despite damage that should have dropped her, and she kept fighting until the chamber was clear and Battle Sisters arrived to take custody of the child. As they led the girl away to safety, the child looked back at Penitent with an expression that was not fear or disgust, but something approaching gratitude. It was a small thing, barely noticeable amid the carnage and chaos of the battle's aftermath, but to Penitent, it meant everything. She had been possessed. She carried the demon's marks on her body and its echoes in her mind. She was tainted beyond full redemption, broken beyond complete repair. But in this moment, protecting this one child, she had proven that something of value remained within her. The demon had not destroyed everything. The sister she had been might be dead, but the person who survived could still choose to do good in the Emperor's name. That was redemption enough. The fortress fell by nightfall. The surviving Repentia, numbering only 7 out of the 40 who had begun the assault, were recovered and transported back to the Order's ships. Penitent was among them, though she had lost so much blood that the Medici expressed surprise she had remained conscious as long as she did. As she lay in the medical bay, receiving treatment for her wounds, the canoness herself visited. It was the first time they had spoken since Penitent's assignment to the Repentia, and the Sister Superior felt a complicated mix of emotions at seeing her former commander. "The Battle Sisters reported your actions during the assault," the canoness said without preamble. "Specifically, your defense of the civilian child. They indicated you placed yourself at significant risk to preserve her life." She was an innocent canoness. Protecting her was simply duty. Duty that Repentia are not typically expected to perform. Your role is to die clearing obstacles, not to serve as guardian to civilians. The canoness was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that Penitent could not quite read. "Sister Mistress Cordelia is dead. She fell during the assault, serving with the distinction that marked her entire career. Before she deployed, she left instructions regarding certain Repentia under her supervision, including you." Penitent waited, not certain where this was going. "Cordelia believed that you had found redemption through your service, that whatever taint you carried from the possession, you had proven through your actions that it did not control you. She recommended, should you survive the assault, that you be released from Repentia status and allowed to serve the Order in a different capacity." "What capacity? I cannot be a battle sister again. The taint, no. You cannot wear the armor or bear the title. But the Order has need of those with your particular experience. We receive reports of possible possession among the Imperial forces we encounter. We investigate cults that use demonic pacts. In these situations, someone who understands possession from the inside, who can recognize the signs others might miss, would be valuable, not as a battle sister, but as a specialist advisor." It took Penitent a moment to process what was being offered. Not full restoration to her former status, but acknowledgement that she had worth beyond simply dying gloriously. A role that used her experience, tainted as it was, to serve the Emperor's purposes. "I accept, Canoness. Whatever service I can offer, I will provide." "Good. Then rest and recover. When you are healed, we will discuss the specifics of your new duties. But understand that you will never be fully trusted, never be fully clean in the eyes of the sisterhood. You will always be the one who was possessed and survived, marked and set apart. If you can accept that, if you can serve despite that burden, then perhaps Cordelia was right about you." After the canoness left, Penitent lay in the medical bay and considered what had been offered. It was not the glorious redemption she had once imagined. She would not be welcomed back with honor, would not wear power armor again, would never again lead battle sisters into combat. But she would serve. She would use the horrible knowledge purchased through her possession to protect others from suffering the same fate. That was purpose. That was meaning. It was not what she had wanted, but it was what she needed. Conclusion. 3 years have passed since Penitent accepted her new role within the Order of the Ebon Chalice. She is older now, marked not just by the mutations from her possession, but by the accumulation of scars from dozens of conflicts. She has investigated 17 suspected cases of demonic influence, helped exorcise 3 individuals who had been partially possessed, and provided testimony to the Inquisition regarding chaos cult tactics on 5 different worlds. She is still not trusted, not fully. Other battle. Sisters maintain distance, speak to her with formal courtesy that barely masks their discomfort. Novitiates are warned not to spend too much time in her presence. Her quarters are isolated from the main barracks, positioned near the penitent chambers, as if she still belongs among the outcasts rather than the redeemed. But she has found a form of peace with this existence. She understands now that she will never be who she was before the possession. That woman died in the desecrated shrine on Tertius Prime, her soul devoured or scattered or simply transformed beyond recognition. What survived is something new, forged from trauma and faith, and stubborn refusal to surrender to either death or corruption. Elaine completed her training and was accepted as a full battle sister. She serves now with distinction, and though their interactions are necessarily limited by the demands of duty and the suspicion that still surrounds Penitent, they occasionally exchange words when their paths cross. The young woman who offered friendship when no one else would has become a reminder that kindness can survive even in the grim darkness of the far future. The nightmares continue, though they have lessened in frequency and intensity. The whispers still echo in the moments between sleep and waking, the demon's voice or the memory of its voice reminding her that she will never be completely free. But she has learned to live with these ghosts, to acknowledge them without letting them control her. Her mutations have stabilized, but not regressed. Her eyes still carry flecks of crimson that glow faintly in darkness. Her hands remain slightly too long, the joints bending at angles that suggest alterations too fundamental to ever be corrected. The markings on her palms burn sometimes with phantom pain, and her voice carries harmonics that mark every word she speaks as subtly wrong. These are the prices of survival. She has paid them and continues to pay them every day. When she speaks to those who have been possessed or who fear possession, she tells them the truth that others will not. Yes, it is every bit as horrible as you imagine. Yes, you will be changed forever if you survive. Yes, there are fates worse than death, and possession is certainly among them. But if you endure, if you cling to whatever fragment of faith survives the daemon's assault, if you refuse to surrender, even when surrender seems like the only escape from unendurable pain, then perhaps you can find purpose on the other side of horror. It will not be the purpose you wanted. It will probably not even be one you would have chosen, but it will be yours, earned through suffering that should have destroyed you entirely. In the Imperium of man, in the grim darkness of the 51st millennium, that is as close to victory as most people ever come. For someone who has been possessed by a demon and survived the exorcism, it represents something approaching miracle. Penitent kneels in her quarters each evening and offers prayers that have become ritual through repetition. She thanks the Emperor for her survival, even though she does not fully understand why she was spared. She asks for strength to endure another day of being marked and set apart. She begs for the wisdom to use her experience in ways that protect others from the horrors she has known. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when no one is watching and she allows herself to feel the full weight of what she has endured, she weeps for the woman she was before the demon came. For Sister Superior Catherine, who died with honor according to the official records, but who actually died alone and screaming while a demon wore her skin. For all the exorcised who did not survive as long as she has, whose bodies gave out, or whose minds shattered, or who simply chose death over continued existence. She has become a specialist in survival against impossible odds, an expert on enduring what should not be endured, a living testament to the fact that faith, while not always enough to prevent catastrophe, is sometimes sufficient to survive it. This is the brutal life of a Sororita who survived possession in Warhammer 40,000. It is not a story of triumph in any conventional sense. There are no glorious victories, no restoration of honor, no erasure of the scars that mark both body and soul. Instead, it is a story of endurance, of choosing to continue existing when existence itself has become a form of penance. It is the story of someone who should have died but didn't, and who has spent every day since trying to determine whether survival was blessing or curse. The answer, as with so many things in the grim darkness of the far future, depends on the moment you ask and the perspective you bring to the question. But she lives. Against all odds, despite all the forces aligned against such an outcome, she continues to exist and to serve. And in a universe where life is cheap and faith is tested beyond all reasonable limits, that simple fact of continued existence represents its own form of defiance against the darkness. The Emperor protects, so the saying goes. And perhaps he does, though his protection takes forms that those who receive it might not recognize as mercy. Penitent has been protected after a fashion, not from harm or suffering or the lasting consequences of her encounter with chaos, but from absolute destruction, from the complete annihilation of self that possession usually brings. She is broken, but functional, tainted, but still capable of service, damned by some measures, yet somehow still faithful despite everything that should have destroyed her faith entirely. In the Imperium of man, that is as close to grace as most souls ever come. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal existence of a Sororita who survived the unsurvivable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40,000 lore. The universe of the 41st Millennium is filled with stories that explore the absolute limits of human endurance and faith, and we're committed to bringing you the most detailed and atmospheric examinations of this grim, dark setting. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, very rarely, there is also survival. And survival, purchased at any cost, is its own form of victory.